Have you ever grown up in an environment where you were raised with certain ideals? Ideals that you never really gave too much thought, that you might accidentally take for granted. But as you start to grow, you develop feelings that seem to conflict with those very ideals. Feelings that some would say are no big deal, and you should be able to express them freely. Meanwhile, others might say they are wrong, and if you were to express them in any way, then you'd be better off not alive. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. You can call me Bizcoon. The following video is a follow-up to one I made a while ago regarding a subject that I refer to as Musselmanity. If you don't know what I mean by that, be sure to check that video out in order to understand the basics, link in the description. That video was mainly made on the fly, unscripted, since I wanted to get my raw thoughts out there. This video, however, will be scripted since I can convey my thoughts much better this way. It also took some time to research since I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything that could be important. Within that video, I made mention of my sexuality, that being gay, which is one that would certainly confuse a lot of viewers, especially those who are well aware of how Musselmen would view someone like me. And yes, I will be referring to them as Musselmen and their faith as Musselmanity in all contexts, including when I'm streaming. You should totally check me out. With the most radical of them wishing either straight up loss of my life, like being thrown off of a building, or being forced to undergo an operation. Things that I am well aware of. So it's only fair that a lot of people would be skeptical of someone like me wanting to reconcile between these feelings and what I believe. It's something I've been struggling to find common ground with for years now, as whether some people like it or not, I see genuine meaning in the Quran's core teachings, regardless of what others have to say. The Quran being the primary scripture of Musselmanity that, from my point of view, so-called believers take for granted, as I personally believe its true message has been distorted beyond recognition, a message I had to find out on my own through a personal and meticulous analysis of the text. In studying the Quran and its words, right down to things like definitions, I was able to find a way to reconcile between these two facets of my being, finding a compromise that allows me to express my feelings in a genuine, honest way, while still being within reasonable bounds. In this video, I want to showcase and explore how I'm able to bridge this gap, a gap that I'm pretty sure a lot of people in my position have had to grapple with at some point in their lifetime, resulting in them either rejecting their feelings to be in compliance with what they believe, or rejecting their beliefs in order to be in compliance with how they feel. All I ask is for you to hear me out and give me a chance. Now, I know when some people hear the phrase "hear me out," they think of the monster lovers section of the Barnes and Noble, but just let me make my case. Listen to what I have to say, regardless of what you believe or how you feel. Before I move on, I want to preface this by mentioning that I have gone on record saying I don't really identify with any particular religious group, as I see the value in all of them, but I clearly lean more towards this without really identifying as such. I mean, the Druze people consider the Quran to be scripture as well, but they don't identify as Muslims, so why should I? And one more thing, you don't have to believe a word I say, nor do you have to agree with me on anything. The last thing that I want to do in that case is to force my beliefs onto others, nor force people to accept me for who I am. If they wish to accept, let them accept. If they wish to reject, let them reject. Now, let's move on. In order to understand the mainstream Muslim consensus on same-sex attraction and expression, specifically between men, there are a series of verses that need to be mentioned as they are the basis of such sentiments. These verses are mainly in the context of what the Quran refers to as the people of Lot, otherwise known as those of the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which I will use interchangeably. One of these verses in particular that tends to be brought up is that of chapter 7, verse 81, which can be read as, emphasis on can because the Arabic language is rather complicated, you lust/desire/crave men instead of women, and you people are excessive/extravagant. That one is usually the go-to when it comes to these things. There are some other verses that could be brought up as well, such as the verse that comes before it, which I'll get to later since it's more relevant to my case than you think. And another of these verses is those of chapter 26, verses 165 and 166. Do you come to the males of this world, leaving behind the mates/spouses the Lord has made for you? Rather, you are a hostile/aggressive/transgressive people. Obviously, one can imagine that it seems quite clear that even so much as having feelings for another man seems forbidden. But the thing is, even though there are verses that can be understood on their own, some verses do require the context of others in order to be understood properly. There's quite a few examples of that throughout the Quran, but those are beyond the scope of this video. The ones I'd like to focus on are in relation to the ones I relayed a moment ago, which I will talk about more in later sections of the video. If you remember the first verse I relayed, 781, there are certain words I'd like to point your attention to, those being shahwat and musarrifun. Now, I should mention that I don't speak or really understand Arabic and my pronunciation isn't the best, so my knowledge of it is rather limited. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not able to comment on this kind of subject, despite some apologists saying that you must know Arabic or else. I mean, Christians don't really need to understand Greek, Aramaic, or even Hebrew to understand the Bible, right? So why should I have to understand Arabic to understand the Quran? There isn't anything within it that says you must know Arabic to understand it. A basic understanding of the linguistics should be enough to suffice in that case. As someone who's always been fascinated by linguistics in general, such as language families and phonetics and stuff, I think it's only fair I should be able to speak on behalf of myself with regards to all this, even if I'm only an amateur at best. But I'll do my best to make my case. So that first word, shahwa, basically means something along the lines of lust, desire, or craving. Some so-called progressive Muslims want to believe that it means grape or asphalt, even though that's not really what it means at all. I'll come back to that later. At that point, we'd be arguing semantics, which people can have a problem with, so I'm not gonna argue too much about that. The next word I'll discuss is musarrifun. This word is sometimes translated as transgression, which is why it gets condemned. Although it can also have the meanings of excessive, overly, or even extravagant. I understand there are many different meanings to words in Arabic, but I'm sure there are plenty of other languages that have the same exact features, but that's besides the point. The fact that this word can mean things like excessive or even extravagant, of all things, means in my mind that it's possible that within the context of this verse, it could be simply calling out those who are more obsessed or addicted to these kinds of feelings, rather than calling out the feelings themselves. Knowing that the core meanings of words in Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew is in the consonants, with vowel markers added later, and in the case of Arabic, certain consonants weren't distinguished until their dots were added, it is very much possible that the meanings of words like shahwa and musarrifun could have had their meanings change over time, a phenomenon known as semantic drift, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the meanings have changed all that much, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt at the very least. I'll comment upon this later, but let's forge on. The next two verses are also dependent on the meanings of certain words. 26:165 has a particular choice of words, such as using the word dhikran, which means male, as opposed to rijal, which means man. This makes me wonder if the men of Lot were going after more than just each other, if you catch my drift. I know that ancient Greece had the practice of pederasty, where teen boys would get into relationships with their male teachers slash masters to mixed results, which could be an example of what that verse might be talking about, but I digress. The next verse, 26:166, mentions the word azwajukum, which overall means spouse, but can mean husband or wife given the circumstances. I noticed that when I put that into a translator, it usually comes out as either spouse or wife, but if I remove the vowel markers, it just becomes spouse. So it likely depends on the vowel markers, but don't quote me on that. Translators are known to be wrong. I'm just doing basic research for the sake of brevity. Within that context, you could interpret the mate/spouses the Lord made for you with a certain amount of leeway that can include a same-sex lover that's made for you, but that might be a stretch that I can touch upon later. The last word I wanted to look at is radun, which for some reason when I put it into multiple translators, such as Bing, Google, and DeepL by itself, it tends to mean those who've returned, meaning it could be read as, rather, you are a returning people or something like that. Although one time it did get translated as enemy, so there's that. Like I said, translators can be wrong, but I still use them anyway because I want to make sure that I get my facts straight. An interlinear on a website known as the Perseus Digital Library of Tufts University, which I use quite a bit in the research for this video, link in the description, says it can mean either aggressive or hostile. The thing is, something I haven't mentioned is that different scholars have translated the Quran in many different ways, sometimes conflicting with each other in how things are translated. Some of the times, words like adun or musarrifun are both translated with the exact same word, like transgression, even though these are two different words with different meanings. I noticed this when translating the whole of verses into different translators. I know that lots of words can be synonymous with each other, but you would think they would want to translate both words differently, based on more relative meanings. That just goes to show that most translations of a language are really just interpretations of that language, and isn't exactly one for one. So it's very obvious to me that even when it comes to the very definitions of these words and how they're translated, it can make a big difference in overall interpretation. Once again, you don't have to agree with anything I'm saying, especially if you speak Arabic natively or fluently. These are just my observations based on the research I've done in an attempt to find some common ground between these two facets of myself. But in case you're not aware, just because you're fluent in the language or speak it natively doesn't mean you know everything about that language, nor do you know the meanings of certain words. I'm sure there are plenty of native English speakers that don't know the meanings of certain words that they might take for granted. Plus, there are many different dialects that can be mutually unintelligible with each other, influencing their own interpretations, such as between Morocco and Iraq. They're obviously not going to understand each other because of how far apart they are. That, along with the semantic drift, where the meanings of words can change all the time, as I mentioned before. Just because a word has a certain meaning today doesn't mean it always had that meaning, and Arabic is no exception. This becomes more relevant if I decide to make more videos like this, although probably not necessarily as highly edited, as this is a video that means more to me than any other, but for now, let's move on. Do you remember in the second section of this video that I mentioned that some verses need the context of others? Well, that is what this next section will address, or at least it'll address one of them. The ones I relayed earlier, especially 781, are usually brought forth as a refutation of the feelings of same-sex attraction, even though it's not as clear as it could be as per my personal analysis. But I think some of the surrounding verses can shed some light in a way that can help me prove my case. Let's take a look at 780, the one that comes before it, that can be read as, "And Lot said to his people, do you do an indecency / lewdness / obscenity / God forbid abomination that no one in the world has done before?" The part that reads, "no one in the world has done before," is the part I want to highlight. You see, one of the arguments that apologists will try to use is the idea that same-sex attraction is somehow unnatural, that no creature would ever do such things. Now, to be fair, just because something is natural, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for you, but I'll touch upon that a little later. But anyone that knows anything about the animal kingdom will know that same-sex attraction between members is very much a real thing that happens in nature, that the apologists are either completely ignorant of or flat out lying about. I remember a video by Persian music theory content creator Faria Faraji in his video about whether or not music is forbidden. It's not. Showed a brief compilation of apologist imams and stuff talking about how same-sex attraction is unnatural, with one of them distinctly saying along the lines of, "A pig would never bang a dog," or something like that. That latter quote I can refute using a few quick anecdotes. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm using a raccoon vtuber model to talk to you guys. The reason it's a raccoon is mainly because they were my favorite animal in middle school and it's still kind of stuck around. Trust me, this is relevant. During that time, I would occasionally look at funny raccoon memes, among other things. One of the things I distinctly remember seeing was a picture of a raccoon mating with a beagle, with the poster of the image basically saying that the raccoon was down bad in today's terms. I'm not going to look that picture up since I really don't want that in my search history. If you don't trust me, you can look it up at your own risk. So, yeah. Another refutation of the idea that these apologists were peddling is that the content creator Casual Geographic made a video not too long ago about why birds like to bang humans. I just referenced 2 examples of these kinds of interactions, yet they say a pig would never bang a dog or vice versa. Right. You can see why I'm so adamant about this subject. But back to same-sex attraction in animals. Such instances have been pretty well documented. There are a number of more well-known examples that could be highlighted, namely sheep and especially bonobos. Same-sex attraction with sheep has been fairly well documented, but bonobos are what I want to highlight in particular. Bonobos, genetically speaking, are the closest to us in terms of DNA, and are well known for being quite sexual in their forms of social bonding, especially between females. In fact, they are relatively matriarchal and peaceful in their conduct compared to their counterparts like chimpanzees. Whenever there's a dispute between them, they usually make up with some activity, doing all the typical things you would expect that I will not go too deep into for modesty's sake. These activities are not as common between males, but it still occurs between them for the same reasons it would between females. The fact that the Quran refers mainly to the men in particular, with the only woman being referenced being Lot's wife, and not necessarily woman-on-woman activities, means to me that whatever the men were doing with each other must have been so obscene that not even an animal would do it. Seeing as male bonobos engage with each other less often than females, it only makes sense that the men would be called out in particular. The thing is, the Quran only mentions what no one or ahad in the world has done before, implying that it must have been something no person in the world has done before, much less an animal. I know that male sheep will have full-on rectal intercourse with each other and that bonobos will do other activities, but the Quran doesn't really specify what that is outside of excessive lust for each other. The next 2 sections will go into what it could be that the men of Sodom and Gomorrah were doing with each other that no other man would have ever done beforehand. And it all starts with a man named Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the historical king of the ancient Mesopotamian city of Uruk, who ruled during the early dynastic period sometime between 2900 and 3550 BC. Scholars generally pinpoint his actual reign to be somewhere between 28 and 2500 BC. Much of what we know about him generally comes from much later sources, often composed over 500 to 1000 years after his reign. So obviously we can take these sources with a decent degree of skepticism, but they can still provide valuable insight into what the Mesopotamians remember about him and how he's perceived, namely his relationship with the wild man Enkidu. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu was created by the Mesopotamian sky father Anu in order to rival Gilgamesh's authority. Gilgamesh himself was being oppressive to his city, and so the creation of Enkidu was basically a form of divine intervention. After the two of them had their encounter through a wrestling match, the two of them made up and became best of friends. The extent of the relationship between these two is the item of our discussion. When someone takes a look at the epic within its own historical, cultural, and linguistic context, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that Gilgamesh and Enkidu had a homoerotic relationship with each other, as brotherly as they would have been. One piece of evidence is regarding a dream Gilgamesh had right before he met Enkidu, one where he saw a meteor flying across the sky with a bright sphere and an axe, where within the dream, he mates with them. Linguistically, the word for sphere in Akkadian is similar to the word for a curly-haired effeminate man, and the word for axe is similar to the word for a male sex worker, specifically in regards to a priest that engages with other men for ritualistic purposes, seeing as the kings of Mesopotamia tend to also be priests as well. You can tell based on a dream like this, at least the way the composers intended, it was meant to indicate that they were indeed homoerotic in their relationship, which in story was also backed up by Gilgamesh's mother. Another piece of evidence was with regards to a game of ball and stick they were playing, which within its cultural context is apparently used for marital rights. One more piece of evidence revolves around Gilgamesh's conduct during Enkidu's funeral. Therein, he is described as having cried the way a man does for his consort, where Enkidu was veiled the way one does for their spouse in ancient Mesopotamian culture. One more thing I can mention is an excerpt translated by a Mr. Andrew George that reads, "You will love him like a wife, and will caress/embrace him." Here, embrace/caress is specifically in the sexual context, based on the original Akkadian word, ahabbab, which seems to be related to Arabic habibi. All of this information I have relayed to you has been corroborated by fellow content creator Metatron, whose video about Gilgamesh can be found in the description, as it was a huge help in my research, so please go check him out. Now, two counter-arguments to both of these analyses is that Enkidu and Gilgamesh had a brotherly relationship that was never explicitly stated to be sexual, and that Enkidu had relations with a sacred sex worker named Shamhat as a means of civilizing him. Metatron made a rebuttal to both counter-arguments, highlighting warriors having relations with each other in the ancient world, and that it is possible to have attraction to both sexes, otherwise known as being bi in the modern day. These counter-arguments tend to have a more modernist perspective of sexuality, of which the people of the ancient past could have essentially considered a foreign concept. One more thing to mention is that after Enkidu died, Gilgamesh went to find Utnapishtim, who can basically be considered the epic's version of Noah in order to learn the secrets of immortality. Utnapishtim was given immortality as a divine gift for saving mankind from that flood, and told Gilgamesh his search was pointless. You can read the story on your own to learn more information. For our purposes, the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu was never brought up, since you would think Utnapishtim would condemn it, being that he is supposed to be the epic's version of Noah, and Noah is supposed to be a prophet of the Lord. It's just some food for thought. All of this information was presented as a means of answering the question of what was it that the men of Sodom and Gomorrah were doing with each other that was so obscene that no man in the world has ever done it before? In other words, what did Gilgamesh and Enkidu not do with each other? Gilgamesh and Enkidu were supposed to have lived at least a millennium before the time of Abraham and Lot, and therefore before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It is highly unlikely that same-sex attraction and expression thereof between men just suddenly originated in the Levant, where Sodom and Gomorrah were supposed to have existed, and it somehow spread all over the world as far as China or even the Americas. So in my mind, whatever the men of Lot were doing had to have been something that not even Gilgamesh and Enkidu would have done. And the next section will go into what that could be. Let us now discuss the topic of zinaa. Zinaa is a term that can basically mean unlawful sexual intercourse outside of marriage, or what the right hand possesses. I'll come back to these later. And can basically be translated as adultery or fornication. The reason I'm bringing this up is because same-sex attraction, or rather the expression thereof, is often considered a form of zinaa due to the fact that more often than not, when two men decide to mate, they often do so from behind. Once again, I don't want to be too explicit for modesty's sake. Obviously, in that context, one could see it as a form of zinaa. The reason is because technically, zinaa only refers to specifically penetrative intercourse, which, for all intents and purposes, I will refer to as going all the way. I think you can see where I'm going with this. Granted, there are some animals whose males will go all the way with each other, like that of sheep, but I digress. Now, something I brought up in an earlier section, mostly because I couldn't find a place to put it while typing this, was that just because something occurs in nature doesn't necessarily mean it's good for you. There are a lot of things in nature that want to kill us. Poisons, venoms, toxins, maulings, you name it. But when it comes to same-sex attraction, obviously it doesn't prolong one species, since you wouldn't enjoy mating with the opposite sex. But that doesn't stop the likes of bonobos from doing it all the time, and they still exist. They're still mating properly. When it comes to humanity in particular, it has no benefit nor really a drawback. Just because you have such feelings, that doesn't automatically make you incapable of mating with someone of the opposite sex. It just means you wouldn't enjoy it. It also doesn't make you infertile and sterile. I mean, people get donor sperm and eggs all the time, as well as things like in vitro, especially when it comes to same-sex parents that want to raise a family. I'm not here to argue the ethics of that stuff, since that's beyond the scope of this video, but my point is, just because a handful of members of a species are same-sex attracted doesn't mean all of them are. We are and always will be a minority. The fact that it refers specifically to going all the way implies to me that if Gilgamesh and Enkidu in particular were in a homoerotic relationship, they would not have gone all the way, since the Quran implies that the men of Sodom and Gomorrah were doing something never been done by others. Meaning not even Gilgamesh and Enkidu were doing whatever it is that the men of the Twin Cities were doing, which is implied to be going all the way. In my mind, if this assertion is correct, and once again, you don't have to agree with me, that means it only becomes an issue should two men decide to go all the way with each other. Ultimately meaning for me, so long as I never go all the way with another guy, nor let them do the same to me, then I think I'd be within reasonable limits. Never being excessive, never being hostile, knowing how easy it would be to slip up. I would do my best not to go too far. But as for the best way to go about that, we can discuss that in the next section. remember how I mentioned that I'd get back to marriage and what the right hand possessed? Well, let's get on with that, shall we? The subject of gay marriage has always been a touchy one at that, and the context of Musselmanity is no exception. With the Quran, most references to marriage are in an opposite sex context, but some people may or may not have noticed that the very concept of same sex marriage is never really brought up. A point I mentioned within my first video about Musselmanity is that the mainstream tradition has a habit of forbidding things that the Quran hasn't already done, such as music or tattoos. Gay marriage is technically one of those things. Yes, most references to marriage are straight, but the fact that gay marriage is never even brought up makes me wonder why. The concept of gay marriage might seem like a modern concept, but there is evidence of it in the ancient world. To use another of Metatron's videos, within the one about gay marriage in the ancient world, link in the description, he outlined several possible instances of same-sex marriage as even sanctioned by the state, namely with regards to a Hittite record involving an enslaved man giving a dowry to a young man as his spouse. There are other examples, such as with Rome, with the whole older upper-class man being the active partner and a younger lower class man being the passive partner, for which they are often relegated to second class status, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's marriage per se, or even with Egypt and Canaan in the context of rabbinic literature, but the Hittite one is the most obvious. So even back then, it wasn't exactly unheard of, but it definitely would have been very rare to say the least. Even so, let's say gay marriage is implicitly forbidden, based on the fact that only straight marriage is mentioned. The only alternative to that is regarding what the right hand possesses, a phrase that I will refer to as what rightfully belongs to you for now. This phrase is mainly in the context of slaves, and more specifically, concubines. Unlike wives, for which you are allowed up to 4 provided they are single mothers, the apologists won't tell you that. Concubines and general lovers of that nature don't really have a limit. The Quran generally prefers that you either marry them or remain abstinent, but you technically do no wrong so long as they are with you. Now, slavery is also a touchy subject, especially with regards to Musselmanity. The Quran generally discourages slavery and encourages the freeing of them, although apologists on the other side won't tell you that either, and has similar stances to the Bible with regards to things like being kind to them, among other things. Now, the Quran never explicitly allows for the acquiring of new slaves except under certain interpretations of verses like 867. The first half can be read as, "It isn't fit for a prophet to take captives/prisoners until the land has been subdued by him." But that's a topic for another time. Although the Quran refers mainly to straight marriage, when it comes to rightful belonging, nothing is really said on that regarding gender per se. So I was thinking, is there any other interpretation of rightful belonging outside of bondage that can provide some leeway for me and others like me? Like belonging to someone as a sort of dependent, since that's how it can work with a typical marriage, like with, I guess, a stay-at-home parent or something. Don't quote me on that, I'm not a legal marriage expert, so I might be stretching it a bit. But something like that would be weird to want to work around and has some rather bizarre implications, as that would technically make one of us a concubine, which I don't think a lot of people would vibe with. Plus, going back to zinaa, that term refers mainly to going all the way outside of marriage and belonging. So are either of these really that necessary for me in this context? If I never go all the way with anyone, much less another guy, wouldn't that make marriage and belonging superfluous? I guess I can figure that out on my own. I don't really have too much else to say here, so let's go ahead and move on. I want to circle back to some loose ends that need tying up. Remember how I brought up the meaning of the word shahwa in 781, and how some so-called progressives argue that it refers to grape and asphalt? Well, I said I was going to come back to it, in that an argument based on what it actually means is that because it talks about desiring and lusting after other men in general, means to them it's unilaterally forbidden. But as we've basically demonstrated, that other word, musarrifun, doesn't have to mean transgression. And the verse before it mentions what no one in the world has done before. Metatron, who is a devout Christian by the way, believes that same-sex attraction has always existed for as long as we have as a species in his gay marriage video. And as I have clearly demonstrated early on with same-sex behaviors in the animal kingdom, it has likely existed for millions of years. In addition to these, there are some other verses I wanted to mention within their respective contexts. 782, the one after the verse that's usually brought up, which can be read as, "His people gave no answer except, 'Kick them out of your town, for they are people who want to be pure.'" There is also a parallel verse in 26:167, "If you don't stop, Lot, we'll surely kick you out." These were their responses to Lot calling them out on their excessive hostile behavior. Personally, I would never want to kick anybody out of my town for wanting to be pure, as I personally resonate with such a message to an extent, which is why I don't want to sleep around with random guys unless I was to find someone who would want us to be together for as long as we both shall live. What I would want to kick you out of my town for is for causing a ruckus and being a menace, which I'm pretty sure most people would want to do. There are some aspects of these verses that others may have missed, that being that these are a series of arguments being had between Lot and his people, and are not necessarily the words of the Lord himself. Yes, the mainstream Muslim tradition considers the Quran to be the literal, verbatim word of the Lord. I'm not here to argue that right now, but these are technically the words of Lot and his people. As someone who personally rejects Hadith and Sunnah as a source of law and teaching, you can understand why I might be bringing this up. Hadith being the reported sayings of teachings of Muhammad, and Sunnah being the way that he was supposed to have lived, which all of these were composed over 200 years after they were supposed to have happened, so they really shouldn't hold as much weight as the Quran itself, at least in my view. I believe that the word of the Lord should take priority over the words of a messenger. I haven't actually brought up Muhammad at all until now. Who'd have thought? Yes, there are verses surrounding the ones in chapter 26 where Lot exhorts his people to fear the Lord and obey him being Lot, and saying he doesn't like what his people do, and that he asked for his family to be protected, of which the Lord did, except his wife, who perished in the cities. But once again, based on everything we've discussed, it seems to me personally that Lot is referring to a specific activity that's never been done before that point, or at least before the cities were even founded, which could be thousands of years all the way back to the Neolithic, given how old Levant settlements are. I mean, Jericho is over 9,000 years old, so we know that there are settlements that have been there since then. As for now, Sodom and Gomorrah can be counted amongst those, it still doesn't necessarily mean that the Levant is where same-sex attraction in humans suddenly originated. I've already touched upon that, so I don't need to touch upon it again. I believe that what Lot is referring to is men going all the way with each other. I could mention the verses about how Lot's people were in an angry mob around a house with two angels disguised as two good-looking guys, with Lot offering his daughter's hands in marriage, with the mob demanding the two guys instead, but I think I've said enough on this subject, and I think it's time to wrap it up in one more section. After everything I have just relayed to you, I think I've been able to make my case as to how I was able to reconcile between these two facets of my being. It's something I've been meaning to talk about for a long time now, but I could never think about how I wanted to say it. I initially wanted this to be an unscripted, free-form discussion like I've been doing, but there was just so much that needed to be said and researched that I wanted this to be organized and structured so that my thoughts could be conveyed in a clear and concise manner. But even after everything that I've just relayed to you, there will be people who will straight up just reject and refute everything, albeit providing their own counter arguments or just outright disregarding everything, not even giving me a chance, saying that, oh, you don't know anything about the Quran. Oh, you're just a grifter, apologist, wanting to spread degeneracy and immorality and all this other stuff, and you don't know anything about the Arabic language, and I'm just trying to speak my mind. I mean, I can only imagine a hijabi woman or a guy in a thobe with a full beard and a shaven mustache crashing out at the likes of me saying, "Ew, brother, ew, you can't be a Muslim and be gay, that is haram!" Or even a Christian apologist saying the exact same thing as if their method of rejecting gays is somehow the correct one. And yes, I am going to take a jab at them as well, because I can and because this is America. Well, joke's on them. Like I hinted at the beginning, I've never claimed to be a Muslim, as I don't believe in the mainstream tradition that's been practiced since at least the time of the Abbasids. If you do ask me what I identify as, I'll simply respond with myself. I identify as myself. To quote the first of the gurus of Sikhism, there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim. There's more I can say about that stuff, but that's for another video. The point is, I know I shouldn't be concerned with what others say about me, and that I have the right to my own opinions, but this is all very important to me. I know I've gone on record saying that my sexuality shouldn't be a big deal, but when it comes to something like this, within this kind of context, it is all very important to me, more than anyone will ever know. All that matters, really, is what the Lord himself says, and I personally believe that he made it purposefully ambiguous as to whether or not such feelings and expressions of same-sex attraction are okay. I think it's something we should figure out on our own, regardless of what others say, without having to give in to one side or the other. And this isn't me speaking on his behalf, him being the Lord. This is me sharing how I personally feel on the matter. I can't speak for him any more than any apologist can. I'm not here to force anyone to think the way I do. I'm here to share my thoughts on how I'm able to work things out. And if I'm wrong about anything I've said up to this point, anything, that I've been misinterpreting it this whole time, or that I've been twisting it in order to suit my own benefits, and that it truly is wrong to express these feelings, then fine. Let me burn. Let me burn. Why are you so concerned with what happens to me on that day for which I arise from my grave and my judgment is pronounced? Who are you to judge me on behalf of the One Most High? He is a far better judge than anyone in this or any other world. And I know he will judge me accordingly, and I will accept whatever fate he sees fit. I would rather burn in hell knowing I was honest with the way I live my life than have to lie my way into heaven knowing it would have been all for nothing, since I would have lied about it. So I don't need you or anyone else to worry about me. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. was apparently an adulterer, but he still considered himself to be a Christian, and is still regarded as one of the faces of the American civil rights movement. If I'm going to burn, then I guess I'll be joining him. What an honor it would be to meet him. And if you're worried about any legal punishments within the context of so-called Sharia, The Quran never explicitly prescribes one at all, despite what apologists will say, saying that they have to die. Except maybe being publicly lashed 100 times, but that requires a number of witnesses and testimonies and only really applies to zinaa, which we understand as going all the way outside of marriage or belonging. This is a lot harder to do than you would think, since these types of things would be done in private anyway, so who exactly is going to be sitting in the cuck chair for that? There's one more thing I need to address before we close out. Something that'll rip their counter arguments wide open. The double standards that need to be exposed in order to cement my case. The migrant crises facing parts of Western Europe, especially the UK, which some of those people will commit acts of sexual assault and rape against British women, knowing the sentences that they receive are less severe than a native British citizen posting an edgy meme about them on social media. Whatever happened to not committing things like adultery and zinaa? Wouldn't asphalting and grape be considered among those things? People argue it's because most British people aren't Musselman, and so that somehow makes them fair game. Even though there isn't anything in scripture that condones such actions of deliberate harm. Aren't sexual relations outside of marriage or belonging forbidden? Why is it okay for you to do such heinous things simply because they don't believe the way you do? But if I were to pursue a genuine, honest relationship with another guy, that makes me worthy of not living, being pushed off a building, being forced to undergo an operation, rules for me and not for thee? If my interpretation of scripture is incorrect, then why should I even listen to it? If you guys aren't even going to do the same. Isn't that what the story of Lot's people is supposed to be about? The rejection of hostile advances and mob violence, excessive lust after others, regardless if they're a man or a woman. Yes, only men are highlighted in particular, but that doesn't take away from the people of Lot's violent tendencies. These are the very things that some of you guys have been doing on a regular basis. Things that the errorists have been doing on a regular basis, including forced sex slaves. You became the very thing you sought to destroy. The very thing the Lord Himself sought to destroy. I don't want to do what's never been done before the time of Lot. I don't want to excessively lust after other men. I know what I'm looking for, and I await the day that I am blessed with the one that's right for me, so long as neither of us go all the way. I firmly believe that we will be within reasonable bounds. And if not, let us burn. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you watched it all the way through, you have my deepest gratitude. It means a lot that you heard what I had to say. I put a lot of time, effort, and heart into making this video. It would mean the world to me if you could share the video, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to my channel so that you can catch my live streams, VODs, and other videos, including more like this one, hopefully. We have a lot of fun with the streams, and it would mean a lot to me if you could join us. Even just watching the VODs will suffice. With all that out of the way, I wish you all a blessed day. Even if you don't believe the way I do, or agree with me on anything I've said in the video. I'm just glad you took the time to notice and hear what I have to say. Greetings upon you. Take care.